Recent news stories have highlighted that young Catholics, both clergy and laity, are increasingly conservative. We're going to look at the reasons behind that growing trend today. Hello, I'm Eric Simmons, your host, editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine. Before I get started, I just want to encourage people to hit that like button, to subscribe to the channel, let other people know about it. Follow us on social media at Crisis Mag, at all the different social media channels, and subscribe to our email newsletter. Just go to crisismagazine.com, fill in your email address, and we will send an email to you once a day with our articles. I feel like I'm a broken record saying that, but I figure there are new people every single time. So we have a great guest today. It's Father Gabriel Mosher. He is a Dominican. He entered the Dominicans 2007. He was ordained in 2015. He spent his first 7 years as a priest at Holy Rosary Parish in Portland, Oregon. He is now pastor of St. Catherine of Sienna in Salt Lake City, as well as the pastor of the local Newman Center. Welcome to the program, Father.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so you're recommending me because this topic I think is very interesting. That we've seen the New York Times had an article not long ago about more conservative priests. The priests being ordained in America are more conservative. Associated Press had an article about the parishes becoming more conservative. So you'd be a great person, dealing with young people a lot and being relatively young yourself. I mean, I can say that with my gray beard here. I mean, you have a great beard, but
I've got a nice one here. But
that's right,
exactly.
exactly.
I'm only 25, so yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So I think it'd be great. But why don't you tell us a little bit first about kind of your background? I read a little bit of it. It's kind of fascinating that how you returned to the Catholic faith and then decided to become a priest.
Yeah, so basically, was raised in a Catholic family. Family is very culturally Catholic, but also not necessarily in a bad way. Culturally Catholic. I would definitely describe my great grandparents as very saintly people, and at least on my mother's side, and then my grandparents also very, very devout people, and so there's a lot of that there. There's a lot of the typical turmoils of my parents' generation and then my own, being sort of at the end of Gen X, beginning of the millennials, trying to rediscover the faith in many ways. It's in some ways I think of it as our rebellion against the rebellious generations, and just discovering that the faith actually matters more than just a label or an identity. I'd always considered myself Catholic, even though, we didn't really go to mass. We didn't participate in the life of the parish. I didn't, I didn't, I wasn't able to participate in the sacramental life of the church until I was an adult. I was baptized. I received my first confession when I was a kid, but not first communion or confirmation. That was when I was 20, 21. And so I think that's a very typical story in many ways. I discovered the need for faith out of tragedy. I was a student at Texas A&M University under the Marine Corps scholarship, and there was a big tragedy there on the campus, and that affected my life tremendously. It caused serious reflections on what's actually important in life, and that sort of brought me back to the consideration of the faith. And in that consideration, I left A&M. I dropped my scholarship. I was having troubles after that. My schooling wasn't going very well. It was just I was a mess, and to be honest, and so I went home, and in the process of going back home to New Mexico, being with my grandparents, because I was living with them at the time, rediscovering the faith in the midst of all that, getting squared away with the sacraments. And at the same time, I was asked by the young priest in my parish, and then later on the archbishop there, Archbishop Sheehan, if I would become a seminarian for the Archdiocese of Santa Fe. And I just said, yeah, sure, why not? And then I did that for a couple years, and then left, worked for the Knights of Columbus, did a couple other things, and then eventually entered the order in 2007. And this is definitely where I needed to be.
There's got to be a certain irony when you said my schooling wasn't going so well, and now you're a Dominican.
Yeah. Well, it wasn't
it's kind of your Dominican's thing is to do school well, right?
No, exactly. A Dominican that isn't studying is a Dominican who isn't praying. So I mean, my education wasn't doing well. And part of it was a lack of discipline, but also I was going through a severe sort of life change and depression and all sorts of like crazy things going on. I wasn't where I was supposed to be, and the way I would describe it having a deeper insight into the faith of how grace works, how God works through us, is I would say that there's, on one part, there was a little bit of a natural problem, because schooling and stuff always came pretty easy to me, so I didn't develop the habits that I needed to be successful in college at first. Uh, that wasn't until later, till I got to the seminary, that I started learning how to do things the right way. And also, the other part of it is that the fruits of the Holy Spirit weren't manifest. It was just clearly not manifest in that milieu, as I look at it retrospectively, and that's not where I was supposed to be.
Right. Now, you were in a seminary about 15 years ago, right?
Mhm.
Yes, right. And so, what was the seminary like then, in the sense of what we're talking about today, as far as like being conservative and things like that? Was it? I mean, because I've heard stories from back, like I have friends my age who were in seminaries in like the early 90s,
Mhm.
and they left because it was just really bad. And I know every seminary is a little different, but like just very liberal, very frankly pro homosexual,
Mhm.
and they left. So what was it like about 15 years ago when you were there?
Well, I'd say that a little correction. I've been to 3 different institutions of formation.
Okay.
So my first experience was in the early 2000s. That was both at Holy Apostles and Mount Angel, and then when I entered the order in 2007, that was with our formation program, which is different than a normal seminary.
Okay.
I could say that, well, when I was at Holy Apostles I entered in 2001. That was a wonderful place. I had a really good experience there. There were, later on, I discovered some problems in the place, some problems with some of the formators, some problems with some of the students. But while I was there, I didn't experience any of that or really even see that. It wasn't very clear to me. Maybe I was just a naive 21-year-old, but I didn't see that. And the philosophy and theology that I got there was excellent. And the liturgy, we were at the very beginning, I'd say, of the beginning of the restoration of uh, some good, solid Catholic tradition. I know that we were the first sort of group of people to rediscover the chanting of the ordinary of the Mass, for instance. We had the St. John Cantius. They weren't called canons of St. John Cantius at those times. They were the Society of St. John Cantius. So they were there. The Fathers of Mercy were there. Our diocese there. The CFRs were going there. A lot of different groups were there at the time, and that experience was extremely positive. And we were heavily influenced by things like the Adoremus Bulletin, and that was around the same time as the New Liturgical Movement blog was going strong in those early days when Sean started that up. A lot of different things like that: sacred music, sacred architecture. We had Stephen Schloter came and gave a rector's conference on sacred architecture because his book had recently been published by Ignatius Press, and it was a really good sort of beginning, our foundation for what was to come. And I think that's because our rector experienced that transition period during the council or after the council, where one summer or one year, as he described it, he was getting calluses on his knees from praying. And the next year, when he went back to the seminary, they forbade him from praying the rosary or doing holy hours or anything like that. So his experience of that, Father Mosey's experience of that, really formed our experience at Holy Apostles. Really good. When I went to Mount Angel, it wasn't the same. There was some goods things there, some really good priests there, a couple of really good ones. But I also experienced some of those negative drawbacks that you discussed while I was there. That's why I left. And but when I entered with the order in 2007, uh, I would say we were very strong, very faithful, desire to be in the heart of the church. There's still some, we're still in the midst, and we still are really in the midst of our renewal and internal reform of our life as Dominicans. But we were really far ahead on the bell curve by the time that I got there, and as I was going through formation.
So
So
do
it's
you
good.
have so Dominicans, do they have their own seminary here in America that you go to?
So each province is responsible for the formation of its own friars. And so we don't have seminaries so much as we have houses of formation,
Okay.
because every Dominican is already a Dominican. We're not growing into anything. We're not seeds in a seed bed, so to speak. So the Eastern Province has the Dominican House of Studies in Washington D.C. The Central Province has their House of Formation in St. Louis, and we have our we have our House of Formation in Oakland and our school in Berkeley, and that's the Dominican School of Philosophy and Theology. And the Southern Province joins the Central Province for their initial formation.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, it's
So,
a completely separate ratio than what the secular clergy get.
right. It is an interesting thing because I don't think younger people realize kind of the sea change between the 80s and even the 90s into the 2000s,
It's huge.
because in the 90s we did have this uptick of, like, from JP2, I mean, mostly that inspiration where you a lot. I converted in that time. A lot of people were converting, a lot
Yeah,
of excitement. Good apostles like a Catholic Answers were really starting to take hold.
yeah,
But the seminaries still were pretty bad. I
yeah.
mean, a lot of them. And
Oh,
then,
even when I was there in the early 2000s, I mean, there were stories of other places that were just horrific.
right.
I've got all sorts of war stories from different priests and friends. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think I'm not saying seminaries are perfect now, but I think the
Mhm.
difference though between now and then is radically different. And so what do you think kind of was the what do you think were the keys that led to seminaries becoming uh, okay, just to for everybody
Yeah.
in the audience to know, when we use the term conservative, we're not talking politically here. We're just simply saying more in tune with the tradition of the church. And I know
Yeah.
there's different ways we can use those labels, but that's all I'm talking about here. Why do you think that happened, and kind of what led to the seminaries becoming more conservative, and I think the men entering being more conservative, I think, when they got there as well.
Mhm. I actually think there's two things, and it's very, very clear to me. It's two things or two persons. John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Those those are the principal influences worldwide that formed people of our age group and younger in the faith. And then also, like, if you think about it, like, as someone who I'm about ready to turn 45 this year, um, I have friends that their children are already out of college, right? So they they're Zoomers and, and, like, even sort of late millennials in some cases. And so their parents were influenced by John Paul II and Pope Benedict, and now them as becoming, like, parents in the next generation already after that, they're influenced by these same things, and so there's this cascading sort of effect, and I think those are the two primary influences, and in some ways Benedict the 16th more than John Paul II. John Paul II was a rock star. He was larger than life, but Benedict the 16th was always by his side, right? He was there since 1978, well, 79 really, as the head of the CDF and then himself Pope, and being part of that theological formation of the faithful from that point forward. And I don't think that's something that can be discounted or even spoken about without, it's superlative. Like, his influence is a superlative influence on the last two or three generations of Catholics, especially English speaking Catholics. I'm not sure about everyone else, but definitely English speaking Catholics. Those are the
Now,
two ones. I would say in the United States, there's another influence that's a subtle influence that people might not be aware of, but it permeates everything, and that's the Integrated Humanities Program from Kansas. So John Senior, I think, has and his godchildren and whatnot have had a profound influence, particularly on the American church.
wow, that's interesting. And isn't that where Bishop Conley, I believe, went through that? I think
Yes.
was he a convert through that? I can't remember now,
Yes.
but I know. Okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah.
And I actually, when he was a priest, he was the chaplain of the pro life group I was in many, many
Oh,
years
nice.
ago. He probably doesn't remember
No,
me at all, but yeah, I've kept up with his career
he's a great
over
guy.
the years. Yes, very much so. Um, so, would you say then today, from what you know, but people you speak to and things like that, would you say most seminarians now, like, what the New York Times saying? Is it true? Because you always have to ask that whenever New York Times says something. Is it actually true? But
Yeah,
would you
fair
say
enough.
that what you've seen from priests coming, young priests over the past few years, that it's continuing this trend of being more conservative, more traditional?
I think by and large, when a young man enters the seminary or enters religious life, same with a sister, they enter religious life, their desire is to be faithful. I don't think anyone enters with a desire to not be faithful. Now, what their conception of fidelity is might be relative, but there is this yearning, this desire to be faithful, and the formation is what tends to shift that and move that one way or another. And I do think that because of these sort of generational movements that you see in the family, because again of John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and among others, Cardinal Sarah is part of that, Cardinal Renze, you name it. There's a whole bunch of people that you can list that have had a profound effect um, on formation, on the Catholic faithful. Uh, these different groups are they don't just influence your average Catholic person on the street. They do influence the professors, what they're teaching. I mean, when I was in the seminary, and then also when I was in initial formation as a Dominican, we were using Ratzinger's Spirit of the Liturgy everywhere. We were using Carbone. We weren't using sort of that older stuff that was very um, contingent in time. We weren't using Rahner or Schillebeeckx or de Lubac or Hans Urs von Balthasar. It was back to Aquinas. It was back to sacred scripture. It was a lot of more sort of stable theological works, and that also led to a lot more stable and traditional liturgical practices. I also think that uh, when there was the period of time when we were going through the revision or the implementation of the new English translation of the Roman Missal, uh, the third typical edition, there was a lot of parish programs and diocesan programs that focused on reading the documents of the Second Vatican Council, particularly Sacrosanctum Concilium. And in actually reading the documents of the council, people would often realize that what they had been experiencing wasn't exactly what the documents had articulated. I remember a conversation with someone who was at first sort of up in arms in the translation change because it was new, it was different, it was conservative, it was all these sorts of things. And then finally, the person realized that it was just a more faithful English translation to the Latin. And this person said, "Oh, well, that makes perfect sense." It was like this immediate shift, like this movement from ideology and how that everything was articulated to just um, a clear shift once the person was confronted with truth, rationality, all these sorts of things.
Right.
I don't know. There's so much. There's so many little pieces, but I think a lot of it has to do with um, this this transition that happened under John Paul II and Benedict XVI. And yeah.
So it still seems to be going on. And do you think? I mean, the elephant in the room is the next pope that you didn't mention.
Hmm.
I mean, he's been pope now for Francis has been pope now for 11 years. Is that
Mhm.
right? Yes, 11 years, and yet we're still seeing a seminaries that are more in America, at least. I mean, we're not speaking about other places. We don't
Yeah.
have experience of that, but um, that are more conservative and things like that. Do you think? I mean, this is all a guess, but do you think that's going to continue? I mean, or is there going to be a more progressive attitude among seminaries kind of entering in, or seminarians coming in because of the influence of Pope Francis?
No, actually, I think by and large for people, the experience of Pope Francis in formation is very different than the experience that people have of Pope Francis sort of out and about.
Okay.
Because again, it's going back to sort of the documents, it's going back to sort of an objective approach to the deposit of faith, an objective approach to the hermeneutic of continuity. These sorts of things form the way in which all this stuff is received. So even when something might have been able to be put more precisely or with a little bit more that could have been articulated more clearly in certain documents. When you read them very deliberately within that sort of Roman tradition of harmonizing, or as Pope Benedict called it, the hermeneutic of continuity, uh, you just can't read these things out of harmony with the larger deposit of faith. And there's many ways to sort of do that. And it's not reading them dishonestly, it's just reading them charitably. And when you do that, it forms the way in which you think about these documents. Um, whether it's fiducia supplicans, or whether it's whatever, it doesn't matter, right? All of these things we can dispute about a lot of the details in the documents, but when they're looked at within the context of the larger history of the church's theological tradition and that mining of the deposit of faith, anything that is found outside of the anything that's found outside of that deposit is not part of that deposit. So it's not. I don't see that being a difficulty right now. I don't see that right now as a difficulty in formation. In fact,
So I
I have
guess
not seen that as a difficulty.
right. So I guess what you're saying is like kind of the focus and formation has really there was an era there, I guess, in the 70s, 80s, where the focus of formation was very much the kind of contemporary, the latest, whoever the latest theologians are and things like that. And now what you're saying is the formation is much more based upon like the ancient tradition. So whether it might be Augustine or Aquinas or some
Yeah.
Trent or whatever. And so everything that comes new is like, okay, we're going to kind of read it through the lens of the tradition,
Mhm.
the deposit, rather than the other way around of kind of rereading like old things, Aquinas, through the lens of Skillebex or something like that.
Right, exactly. And it's I think Pope Benedict put it well there. He At one point he used this image. He said the church is always looking forward with one eye looking back. And so there's always this dual movement, because we're moving forward in history, but we're always bringing the democracy of the dead with us, right? There's no way to sort of negate that. And anyone that would is already outside of the heart of the church, because the church is always perennial. The deposit of faith is something that Christ gave us. It's not something that can just be set aside. And it's that radical fidelity to the person of Christ, that encounter with him, that is uh, sort of the manifestation of a person's faith, even though the faith, is imparted in baptism, but that igniting of it in the encounter with the person. Once that happens, it's really hard. I think it's really hard to sort of step away from that. And institutionally, it becomes even harder. Institutions are like battleships, right? It takes a while for them to move in the right direction. So it's taken a couple decades. People make fun of now. It's almost a meme. Jump all the seconds, new springtime. But I think there is kind of a new springtime. But it's just again, it's a battleship. The institution takes a long time to turn, and then once it turns, it's going to take a lot for it to turn away. It's there's I see a lot of stability. I see a lot of good. Some of the teenagers that were in my youth group when I was in the early 2000s, they're priests. Now they're running formation programs. They're vocation directors, and actually I know one who's running a propedeutic year at a seminary. And these are solid guys, like with really, they don't they don't they carry different baggage. Like they're not coming from an embattled position, because we had already sort of won those battles,
Right.
so to speak. And so they're moving in this. They're sort of working in a different, I don't know, a different existential space when it comes to looking at this formation. There's much more calm, much more peace, much more stability to the work of formation, to what's happening in seminaries and in
Right.
religious orders. There's still outliers. There's still
Right.
places that need work, and not everyone is in the same place with respect to that renewal. But it's a real thing. Like I've seen it everywhere.
Okay, this is interesting because this leads into my next question, which I'm actually going to ask a little differently based on what you just said. Because uh, I remember in the '90s when I first became Catholic, things weren't that great, and people would say, "Well, look at the young people the young men becoming priests, they're more conservative. So in 20 or 30 years, they're going to be the bishops, they're going to run the church, and everything's going to be so much better because of that. And of
Yeah.
course, we all know it's not like everything is hunky dory today. And so like I admit there's a certain amount part of me. There's probably a cynicism of getting older, which I need to fight. I realize, but the idea of
All of
like,
us. Yeah.
yes, right. When I hear like, oh well, the young people, they're more conservative. I admit one of my first thoughts is I've heard that for 30 years,
Yeah.
and it sounds like you're saying there really has been an improvement, but it
Mhm.
over those 3 years, it just hasn't been. It's not always visible to like in the news stories or things like that. Is that kind of what you're saying? Would you argue, or would you say, because it looks to me, okay, I'm just going to lay it out here.
Sure.
What it looks to me, it looks
Sure.
to me like like a lot of those guys who were so much great and on fire in the 90s became priests. They end up becoming just kind of bureaucrats who just kind of go along, and
Yeah.
they're not really kind of have that same juice for orthodoxy that they used to. Now it's more a matter of just managing things. And
Mhm.
maybe I'm being too harsh. Maybe I'm that's not accurate. What would be kind of your perception of that phenomenon of what's been happening since the 90s, as far as young priests that are on fire in Orthodox when they come in, and how they end up?
So I think there's three different points that I would hit. First one is it's very easy to become institutionalized. Institutional drag is a real thing, and when you realize that there's all these things that have to be done in order to maintain the institution of the church, that can really sort of weigh you down. You can get stuck in your office and never see people. Like, you may be a great bureaucrat, you might be able to raise money and do all those things and maintain sort of black books and whatnot, instead of red ink and all these sorts of things, and that makes you sort of appear to be a good candidate for advancement through the institution. But whether you have any evangelical zeal left over after that, that's a whole different question. But I've seen institutionalization happen, and it happens by inches. People don't even recognize it, and sometimes that institutionalization doesn't even happen until someone becomes, say, a bishop, right? They have that evangelical zeal, but then they become a bishop, and then they're kind of stuck in their chancery office, with having meetings all day long instead of going out and engaging in the ministry of the word like the apostles intended. So, how to solve that, I think, to some degree, is one of those $1 million questions.
Right.
So I'll leave that at that. The other thing about I just read an article from the Wall Street Journal the other day that showed this Gen Z and sort of the change in political demographics. And I'll use this as an analogy for what's happening in the church because I think it's similar. Is that Gen Z, for instance, is split, and is split on lines of sex, right? So men are moving more conservative politically, women are moving more liberal politically, by and
I saw
large.
that. Yes, I saw that.
Yeah, and it's a significant gap, right,
Right.
in their ideologies. And what was interesting in that article, and I don't think it was a mistake, is that the young man that was being sort of looked at, he was wearing he was obviously Catholic because he had a Marian shirt on and all these things on his tractor. But there is this sort of movement towards a type of a rejection of some of these aspects of modernity that are in conflict the with what the church teaches, what Christ teaches. And there's a segment of people uh, that are embracing what the church teaches and see the value of that. And then there's the people that are rejecting it. And I think the group of people that are accepting it, that you say more within the context of the language of the church, becoming more conservative or living in the heart of the church, are is a growing group of people, but it's a smaller group of people when compared to the larger society.
Mhm.
Because I think right now and this is the third point, is that there is no social advantage to being Catholic, and there is certainly no social advantage to being faithful. Uh, and so it's a self-selecting group. We see this even, at at a Newman Center or at a parish, particularly my last parish was very much uh, a boutique parish. It's one of the parishes where people go to. It's a destination parish, so it's very self-selecting in the people who attend that parish. And we're seeing that more and more. The older generations had a sense of duty. You went to church because you went to church. Like you were taught to do that, and you follow those rules. That's how it worked. But I think starting with the later Gen X and definitely with millennials and Gen Z, there are no rules like that. There's no interior disposition like I go to mass because I have to, right? Or my grandmother's going to be angry with me if I don't go to church. Like, who cares? Right? It's a self-selecting group, and so as this group continues to be self-selecting, you'll have, as Benedict said, a smaller, more faithful church. I think that's just the direction that everything is moving, and people find that very troubling for multiple reasons. I find it troubling because that says, or rather, what does that say about our work of evangelization, of our ability to actually convince the secular world that Christ's message is not only true but effective, and that it's something that attracts the human spirit, attracts the human soul away from the world, the flesh, and the devil. And I think that's where the challenge is, the real rub. And so when a larger demographic starts showing up again in the churches, well, I don't know what it's going to look like, but right now it's that self-selecting minority.
So, in your experience, like running Newman group and things like that, and just working with young people, so you would say then that it's definitely true that the young people who are active in their faith are far more conservative than like the general population. Is that a pretty safe statement to make?
Oh yeah, very much so. Yeah.
Okay, and so that's mostly then who are attracted to going to this are people who are really, I don't know a better way to put it, but just really into their faith, I guess is the best way to put it. Like, because I know, like when I was in college in the early '90s, and I was not Catholic, but I knew a lot of Catholics at this point. We didn't have a Newman Center, but it was like the local parishes, college outreach,
Sure.
whatever.
Hmm.
It was a large college in here, and it had hundreds of people in it. But it was most of them. It was people who just, as it was all Gen X people who were in college at the
Hmm.
time. Most of them, they just lived like everybody else as
Hmm.
far as drinking, partying, stuff like that, mostly. And then they would go to mass on Sunday and they would go to some of the events. But it
Hmm.
was a very large group because I remember there was a small group of people, Catholics, who were like very serious. And that's
Yeah.
why I got attached to as a Protestant, because pro-life work. And
Sure.
they really didn't want anything to do with the bigger group because they were like, they're not really faithful, they're not
Hmm.
really trying. So would you
Yeah.
say basically now what's happened is we've just eliminated that big group of most of them are just not going, and now it's just left to the small, like you said, self-selected group?
Well, that's some of the things that the data is telling us even post-COVID, right? Is that
Right.
there's so many people that just didn't go back to church
Right.
because in the post-COVID thing, in some ways that's moved that ball forward to some degree. All the all the data that we see tends to say that it's just a self-selection. It's has very little to do with anything other than that. Is people who are coming to mass, people who are participating in the sacramental life of the church, and people who are participating in the social and ministerial life of the church. um, they mean it, and
Right.
it's beautiful. I mean, I thanked my congregation the weekend before last because at my parish, nobody leaves after communion, right? That's just that's always been the joke. That's always been sort of the thing. Like,
Right.
how many Catholics are running out to the parking lot, to get out of
Right.
there after
Right.
they
Did you just
get
shuffle?
Holy
Right.
Communion? But it's so rare, and it's always a visitor or someone that we never see on a regular basis who
Right.
leaves prior to the end of mass. Like, the priest is always the first person out,
Right.
and that in itself is kind of an impressive thing if you think about it, based off of the culture of
Right.
how people would go to mass. I mean, at least my whole life, people
It's not
coming
like
in
you were
late.
saying every week, don't leave after communion.
No, you didn't
Right.
have to
It's
stay
just
one bit. People
right.
just stay. They're happy to stay, and they want to build a community of faith. They care, and that's, I think that's precisely what Pope Benedict was talking about.
Right.
And it's from that core that something more can be built, right?
Right.
And so I have great hope and great faith that from that core will be built something more, a restoration of some sort. Again, sort of using that John Senior language of the restoration of Christianity. Um, I think that's a real possibility, and I don't buy into the idea of a dead notion of Christendom. And no, I think it's our job to build, just like Pope Paul the Sixth said in Evangelii Nuntiandi, is that our job is to evangelize the culture itself. We are to make the culture Christian, and so if we work towards that, that is the reestablishment of some sort of Christendom. And
And
whether it looks like the former Christendom, probably not, but
yeah.
it will look like something, and it will be beautiful. We just have to do it, and we have to put our back into it.
Yeah, it's interesting Pope Paul VI said about making the culture Christian, because what you see is, especially among the few remaining progressive Catholics that are left, this idea of, they don't say it like this, but basically we need to be more like the culture, and
Yeah.
that will attract people. Then that's
Mm.
because we all know we have dwindling numbers. I mean, the numbers are going down on a whole. I mean, that's obvious to everybody. And I see a certain desperation among some Catholics that, like, okay, well, if we don't accept women priests or whatever, homosexuality, all that stuff, then like more people are going to leave. And here's one thing I think conservatives don't always acknowledge: that actually is true on a very surface level, in the sense
Yeah.
that you will get people. But the fact is, it's not like, we know from the Anglicans and everybody else, that's not a long-term way to grow your church.
Correct.
Because people are leaving now because we're not liberal enough for whatever they want, and I know people like that, and I'm sure you do too.
Sure.
But then, so what you would say then is, the 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 shrinkage of the church. Obviously, it's a bad thing objectively. Kind of just, we want every soul in the church.
Yeah.
But you're saying it can be a good thing long term. And
Hmm.
so is that because, like, you're saying that because the people left will really be now faithful, and that will attract the masses, won't it? I mean, are we in danger of becoming so becoming like the Amish? Is that a danger that we could just end up like the Amish? That, let's be honest, the Amish, they're awesome in a lot of ways, but they don't impact the culture at all.
That's right.
And so is that a danger that we have in the kind of the trajectory we're going?
I think it is a danger. The danger is, so I guess controversially, I'll say, is I think the danger is what was spoken about as the Benedict option, right? I don't think that's the correct approach. We have to engage the culture, but you engage the culture from a place of stability and uh, fidelity. And so, to some degree, there needs to be sort of that same instinct that Saint Benedict had, of retreat from the world in order to establish that fidelity. But then you also have to have the instinct of Saint Dominic, which is that, yeah, but from that monastic disposition, from that disposition of contemplation and study and fidelity, you engage. That preaching is the fruit of contemplation, and preaching happens in both word and deed, and it is incumbent upon us to engage the culture. That doesn't mean that we have to be like the culture, but we have to be in those cultural spaces. This is why I get very frustrated all the time when people think that clergy or whatnot should not have any involvement in politics, or shouldn't have any involvement in various social things, or in the arts, or all this other stuff. No, no, no. Religious and priest should be in all of those places. One of the things I actually think was a huge mistake of John Paul II's was forbidding clergy to run for office. I mean, it used to
Wow.
be one of the greatest reformers of the church and of our order was Lacordaire, and Lacordaire always served in public office wherever he was assigned as a Dominican, even in the General Assembly in France. And he was able to affect people in those spaces as a result of his presence. I mean, St. Thomas Aquinas used to spend time with a French court. I mean, one of the most decadent institutions in human history. And there's St. Thomas Aquinas there, sort of writing his stuff in the corner, in the midst of all of that. Like, we can't exempt ourselves from any of the spheres of human life. But we can't be the world, right? We can't be like the world. We have to bring that otherness to the culture and call it to conversion. But you can't call it to conversion if you're not there.
Right. And I think we have to recognize that it could happen where we go through a phase like the early church did, where that means persecution and martyrdom and things like that. But that's really that's up to the Lord whether
Just
or not
par for
that's
the
going to happen.
course.
Yeah. So I want to bring up the role of the liturgy in how the church is becoming, in America at least, becoming more conservative in practice, because that's usually the touchstone. I mean, lex orandi, lex credendi, we know how
Always.
instrumental it is. In fact, the article in the AP was a lot about how a parish had become more conservative liturgically, and that drove out. This was up in Madison, Wisconsin, I believe, and a lot of the boomers and others didn't like it. That all of a sudden the things they had been doing, their tradition, was
Mm-hmm.
now thrown out. And so, what would you say? And so, of course, we know the history a little bit, but like in the '90s, the traditional Latin Mass was like unheard of to the average Catholic. Then, of course, it starts growing in the early 2000s. Pope Benedict, opens it up basically to the world. It starts to grow, becomes very influential. Then, of course, we all know Traditionis Custodes. Francis is clamping down, which seems to be making it grow more in popularity in a lot of ways. But how would you say, how has the liturgy has it followed the people becoming more conservative, or is it the driver of them becoming more conservative, or is it a little bit of both?
So my previous parish, we had a Dominican mass on a daily basis, right?
Oh, that's awesome.
It's fantastic. So every day is a low mass, and then on Sundays is a sung mass or solemn mass. And before that, when I was in formation, I used to spend a lot of time with the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest and with in Oakland. And then before that, when I was in the seminary, right, I spent a lot of time with the Society of St. John Cantius. And these movements personally had a profound effect on me because I didn't know anything. When I went to the seminary, I was completely ignorant about stuff. So many people that go to the seminary, like they've been reading things and studying stuff before they even take one foot into the seminary. They was just like, hey, you should go. I'm like, okay. And so I went, right? And I learned in the seminary about things. And I fell in love with the older rites because the symbolism and the ceremonies are very clear, at least to me. The symbolism speaks volumes in a way that I think the ordinary form in its usual parish context doesn't as well. I think that I do want to read the liturgical reformers positively. I think they were trying to, because I do believe that there are some problems. I don't think the church has fully ever accommodated the change in human life that the Industrial Revolution affected. A way that I describe this is that, like, I don't have a proper blessing for electric lights. Right? Why is there not a proper blessing for electric lights? There's candles and lard and bacon, and there's crosses for fields. So everything is still sort of very agrarian. There are some things like there's a blessing for a dynamo, there's a blessing for a telegraph and for a seismograph, but there's not many things. Even the blessing for a vehicle, for a car, is really just the blessing for a kudos, right? It's just a chariot, and just appropriated for a car. Um, so there is a real sort of discontinuity to some degree between the devotional and liturgical structures and cycles, and the modern way of living. Even the way the divine office is cut up and prayed, or where mass is situated during the day, is discontinuous with the tradition because electric lights. You can say mass anytime now, right? Um, but and also the fasting cycle is broken, which is a more historic thing as well. So I think the more people learn, actually, I think the more there's accessibility to the knowledge of liturgy, not that you attend liturgy. So Americans, at least, by and large, for the last 150 years, have been habituated to be consumers of religious experiences.
Right.
So people go to mass because it satisfies me or because it entertains me or whatever. This is why, rock band mass is a thing and all this other sort of stuff, because it's something familiar. It's like, it makes me feel good. But that's not what mass is for. Mass is about worshiping God and then receiving those graces as a result of the work of worshiping God. And the more that understanding becomes prevalent among the faithful, the more there are study groups on the documents of the council, the more there are study groups on things like the Spirit of the Liturgy from Ratzinger or other such works, the more that liturgical world is brought into the common sphere. I think Scott Hahn did a great job with this with his book, The Lamb's Supper. It's one of the most accessible pieces of fundamental, like early sort of discovery of liturgical ideas. The more that is the case, the more people realize that there's something broken in their day-to-day liturgical practice, that what they experience. And I'm not talking just simply about the difference between the older rites and the modern rites, the revised reformed rites, but that in the reformed rites after the council, that the way in which most people experience those rites is not consistent with what the council wanted, or even with what was implemented by the concilium. Uh, I don't think the concilium people would have ever expected, some of the things that have been experienced over the years.
Right.
Uh, but also, I think so. What happens is that when you see that, you can react against that, and when you go to the older rites, because they're far more mature, because they've developed and they've had a longer history and patrimony, the signs are much more clearly articulated because of that period of time that they were in dominant use. Uh, it's very comforting. I think so I don't think it's just a matter of taste. I think that the signs actually do communicate something more to people. And as Aquinas says, that the devotio or solemnitas of actions, it affects devotio in the person. And the more that a devotio is influenced in the person or excited in the person, the more grace they're able to receive. So there is a reality to this. It's not just aesthetics. It's not just taste. Like there is a direct line between solemnity, devotion, and the grace received. Not the grace offered. The grace offered is the same, but the grace received, the subjective disposition, is directly related to the solemnity of the act. And so the less solemn something is, the less a person is disposed to receive grace, the more solemn something is. And I do think that by and
And
large,
I
we
just want to interrupt, but that is
Oh,
such.
sorry.
I
This
was
is a
going to say,
big.
well, no, I just want to interrupt because that is such an important point. What you just said, that's why I wanted to stop for a second because I
Yeah,
didn't want to go over that one quickly because you hear often like the argument, like, well, it's valid and that's all that matters. And
it's
it's
not all
like,
that matters.
it's like Jesus is there, so that's all that matters. But what you just said is the key point. Cause I had a priest, I remember, who at a parish, who was training the altar boys, and my son was one of them. And I was at this, it was like for fathers and the boys there. He made that point about the more graces are able to be received at, like, for example, a solemn high mass and a low mass. And he used that
Mhm.
example to not make it a Novus Ordo versus Church TLM, but just to
Yeah,
say, because there's greater solemnity, it's kind of what you were saying. And that's the reason why the church developed these ceremonies
yeah,
over 1,000 years and more, because of the fact they recognize, okay, our people are going to be more open to the receive the graces. Like you said, the grace isn't offered isn't different. It's just the grace received can be different.
yeah.
There's the objective and subjective. So I apologize for interrupting, but I just
No,
was
no,
like,
that's
okay,
fine.
that's one I gotta make sure everybody heard that part of
Yeah.
what you were just saying.
Yeah, no, I apologize. I can get on a soapbox about that because it's particularly frustrating to me.
Right, right. It
Yes.
is. And so I think another thing I wanted to mention was what you said about, you kind of briefly mentioned Scott Hahn's The Lamb's Supper.
Yeah.
I personally think that had a huge impact on the church in America
Mhm.
liturgically, because the book
Yeah.
itself, for those who don't know, it came out in like the late 90s, I think, has sold, I think, millions. I'm not 100% sure the number, but it's
Yeah.
hundreds of thousands, I know. And I think even millions of copies. He was probably I think it's his most popular book. And
Probably.
that's saying something because all his books are popular.
Yeah.
But it's not like a book about like the old rite, or it doesn't even mention that. It's assuming the Novus Ordo. But what it did was, and I know it did for me too, like a light turned on in a
Mhm.
lot of people's Catholics' mind, that oh my gosh, the liturgy is like super important.
Yeah,
This is
it's
like, I mean,
literally is the source and summit of the Christian faith,
right.
right?
But like nobody, it's almost like we just treat it like, well, this is what we do, but really that's not that big a deal.
Yeah,
And I think people don't realize how many people Catholics thought like that. And then
yeah,
this book comes out, and I will say then what happened. I'm not saying this was Scott's intention, but I think what happened was a lot of people then went back to the parish and they're like,
yeah,
ugh, for how important this is, we seem to be taking it not very seriously.
yeah.
And I think that then, and then just a number of years later, with some more on Pontificum, of course. And so I really
Mhm,
think that might have been like a seedbed to make, and then even in the Novus Ordo parishes to start being like, you start to see a growth of, and I don't think these problems are solved, but like definitely you get more reverent liturgies more often. I think
mhm.
part of it was his book just all of a sudden kind of clicking on the light that, let's actually take this seriously instead of acting like it's just like it's a Protestant service and we don't really care that much about how we do it.
No, I totally agree. It sort of opened up a veil,
Right.
that people, and I think it's because it did that for him, right?
Right.
There's that moment where he talks about in, I think he talks about it in the introduction there, but he also talks about it in A Father Keeps His Promises. He talks about it in multiple places where, the first time he kinda goes to a mass where he's at the moment of the Agnus Dei, and he goes, "This is either the most profound blasphemy I've ever experienced in my life, or this is real."
Right.
Like, you like, there's something about his, his own intellectual habits, and his knowledge base that allowed for a clarity for him to see that, that moment, it's like there's a grace given there at that moment for him, and we've all, benefited as a result of that. Yeah, yeah.
What do you see as, and this is like the question that you can ask, and I know you're just gonna, who knows what's gonna happen, but
Mhm.
what do you think the future is though for the liturgy and the Roman Rite? Because Benedict obviously wanted to see a certain mutual,
Yeah.
uh, enrichment and things like that, and I think people at that point, I know I was one of these people at that point, thought, okay, eventually what we'll probably get is like a hybrid of some sort that will be traditional Latin Mass in a lot of its essence, but then we'll have some reforms that were inspired by Vatican
Mhm.
II in that era and things like that. But then, now with Traditionis Custodes, I feel like it's gotten to a point where it's like, no, there's no connection between the two almost. I mean, Francis himself doesn't call them forms
Yeah.
of the same Roman Rite. He treats them like there's two foreign rites to each other, almost like the Eastern Rite and the Roman Rite. And so,
Yeah.
what do you think, though? I mean, just your crystal ball, like, how do you think this eventually gets resolved? Because obviously, their current situation is not a tenable one long term.
Mhm. Well, I mean, my hot take on that is that in my mind is that if you wanna worship in English, you should be a member of the Ordinariate. If you wanna worship in Latin, celebrate in the Roman Rite. But that's my
I
super
love the
hot take.
ordinary. Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Yeah. But, uh, I honestly don't know. I can tell you what my own personal, practice is as a priest
Yeah,
is, uh, to be very diligent about reading the rubrics precisely of the liturgies so that, the places where, the more traditional ars celebrandi is available, that is implemented. And it's not so much ideology, it somewhat is on my part a little bit, but it's also because there is a sense that, when the concilium was put together, one of their theories, or the way I was taught, is one of the theories was by paring back things and allowing for, openness of interpretation, that it would allow for, a new modern thing to develop that is consistent with the tradition, but wasn't attached to necessarily, the French Renaissance court. So, and as a Dominican, I can respect that because our own liturgy is very different than the Tridentine Mass. It's signs and symbols, its movements, its actions, the way reverences work. Everything is very different than the Roman Rite, and so you can tell that it was founded within a period of time of the medieval city state, like, and it sort of exemplifies that form of statecraft where the Trinity Mass sort of exemplifies the statecraft of the risen Renaissance court. Um, just like the Byzantine is the Byzantine court, right? And I think the ordinary form sort of is sort of emblematic of the modern city state in many ways, the forms of reverence and simplicities that exist here. But the liturgy allows for a lot of interpretation, right? Liturgical norms are not negative precepts; they're positive precepts. So there's a lot of variability for interpretation, and so the interpretation that I use is again that hermeneutic of continuity. How can I be as continuous with a tradition as possible, without being, without breaking the rules myself? And so where things can be bent, where things can't be. And I think you're going to see that more and more. I think there's a lot of priests that are interested in that actively. I know many priests that are, and there's books being published about celebrating the ordinary form of the Roman Rite with that sort of disposition, that disposition of a traditional ars celebrandi. Um, where things go from here with, I with respect to what things can be restored. I think actually I joke about the ordinaria, but I think they're a good example of what ought to happen. For instance, they restored the offertory prayers. Like that's something that needs to be done.
Right.
The old offertory prayers are very important to the Roman Rite, and I think that they were removed erroneously. I quibble about the reading cycle. There's a lot of different things here and there that I think could be adjusted and fixed and done either by just understanding the rubrics and just doing them because you're exercising different options. But there's some things that only Rome can do, and I think that there has to be sort of that honest reflection in Rome about sort of like, well, maybe the concilium wasn't 100% correct about removing this or
Right.
by imposing that. And
Yeah.
who knows how that's going to work.
And it's interesting because newly ordained priests, since Jurisdius Custodes, need explicit permission
Yeah,
to celebrate the TLM, and I think my understanding is they don't really receive that in general. But I know a lot of them. I mean, I say a lot. I know of that they're learning the TLM just to say privately because they're still allowed to say it privately. They can't be stopped from that, and so I think that alone is a good thing because it gives them, first of all, hopefully it helps their spiritual life as their priestly life, but also then it's going to impact how they then celebrate the Novus Ordo, in their parishes and whatnot, which, is a good thing. So, but yeah,
yeah,
we don't know what's going to happen. But I think it is interesting. I think though, ultimately Ratzinger, I think his father Ratzinger time turned out to be a prophet, and his,
yeah.
because that was in the early 1970s. I think it was 71. He made that prediction that the church will get smaller, but basically stronger in a lot of ways, and then have to go out from there. So,
Yeah.
we'll see. So, I think I'm
Well,
going to finish
we can
there,
pray.
but yeah, right, exactly. Well, I mean, yeah, we always
Yeah,
pray.
you gotta pray, man.
Yeah,
It's intense.
it's also, we have to realize these things aren't linear. They're just like super bumpy, and they're
Mhm.
going to go down and up and things like that. So we just keep praying and doing our
Well,
best. So,
and honestly, trusting that God is in control, right? In the
yes,
end. But
right,
we have to participate in that and truly uh not just sit on the sidelines, but be active participants in the life of the church. And by doing that, then true conversion, not just of ourselves, but of other people, but also of the institution, is affected by engaging, right? Not disengaging.
right, absolutely. Okay, Father, I think I'm gonna wrap it up here. Where can people find it? I mean, you have a X account, right?
I do, yeah.
Yes, I will link to it. Even you may not even want me to, but I'm going to link to it in the show notes.
Yeah,
um,
perfectly happy to,
Good. So people can follow you there and
Mhm.
kind of get your thoughts on things. So I appreciate you being here, though, Father.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and that same handle, that Luke I 4655, is me everywhere online. So
Okay,
I try and secure that everywhere.
right,
So
perfect.
yeah.
That way they know it's really you when they see that.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. Yeah, there's consistency from, across the interwebs. Yeah,
Yeah, right, exactly. So,
yeah.
okay, thank you, Father.
All right, God bless you.
Until next time, everybody. God love you.